Good morning, Mrs. Lentz.
Good morning.
I just want to say thank you, first of all, for allowing me to come into your classroom and observe your class. It was most enjoyable to see so many things happening in your classroom in our 90-minute period of reading. I just have some conversation that I'd like to have about our observation, and most of the time I'll let you do the talking so that we can just kind of reflect on what I saw and what you were doing, so that we can move forward in teaching, because reflection is a very important key to how we improve our teaching and learning.
Absolutely.
So first, could you just share your learning objective for your lesson that I saw today?
Sure. So the goal of my lesson, the objective was for students to be able to identify a specific text structure used in a nonfiction paragraph.
Okay, great. And how do you feel the lesson went today?
Overall, I think it went really well. Based on the data I gathered throughout the lesson, it shows that students have grown. They're beginning to put that together. This is a hard skill for fourth graders to understand these concepts that they've learned in reading all through kindergarten. How does that, authors purposefully write those paragraphs using those structures? And so I think they began to become more critical readers to understand the purpose that authors use and the structure that authors use in order to convey a message.
And so based on your preparation for the lesson and then your delivery of the lesson, how does these two things compare with what you expected would happen with the lesson?
Well, I think that one thing I've noticed about myself is that I plan a lot for a little bit of time. So one of the expectations that I had was that we would be able to have ample amount of time for groups once we got through the song and the game and all of those other activities that I needed beforehand. However, we kind of were a little short at the end, and so I think maybe extending this lesson over to class periods would allow for more of that time, because I think that small group time is very important. However, I expected kids to be engaged and to become masters of that vocabulary by the end of the lesson, and that was something that I did see from students towards the end, was that they were engaged the entire lesson and they were able to identify each one of those text structures and really what they were by the end of the lesson.
Great, that's wonderful. So how did you differentiate your lesson?
So I started by pre-assessing my students prior to this lesson, and was able to see that the majority of students needed help in this area. And then for the game, we put them into small groups based on their reading and their ability level, as well as what they had shown me on the pre-assessment. So I had 3 level groups of a lower reading level and a middle reading level, and then above reading level, where they have peers of their own ability. And then I also flexed in kids based on their understanding and mastery of text structures.
So one of the things that I was not able to see in our 90-minute period was that pre-assessment. So what did that look like? What kind of data were you collecting during that pre-assessment?
Students were asked to read a passage, and the questions asked exactly what we did today, which was what is the text structure used by the author. However, only 20% of my class were able to actually identify correctly the text structure that was being used. And so for me, that was a red flag, because that clearly was an area of growth for my students that we needed to really focus on prior to continuing to read nonfiction text, so that we can become more critical readers and consumers of nonfiction texts.
So one of the strategies that I saw you use today was a game called Headbands. Mm-hmm. And so what was the objective of using that strategy?
This is twofold. For the guessee, or the person guessing, they had to think through that vocabulary that came with text structures and be able to identify it based on the clues being given by their group mates. And for the group mates, it pushed them to describe the vocabulary using different methods, because if a student didn't get, for example, if their card was compare and I said cats and dogs, the person guessing didn't understand that, force them to think critically about what are other ways you could describe what they were needing to guess in a way that would help them. So for me, I saw their vocabulary expanding. They were deepening their knowledge of those text structures. I had taught them hand motions prior to playing the game, and so connecting that hand motion, that kinesthetic learning with what they were showing. So for everyone involved, just to kind of solidify that vocabulary understanding.
And so, did you feel that you were successful in meeting the objectives of that strategy?
I do. I think that as I walked around from group to group while they played each round, I heard great vocabulary being used, good clues for the guesser to take and to guess from. And then I heard, when we moved and transitioned into small groups, some of that vocabulary coming back. And so I was able to reference those words, knowing that they knew what I was talking about. Whereas prior to that lesson, I think there was still some confusion about what is cause and what is effect and what is problem and what is solution and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. So, thinking of your lesson as a whole, then, how did you help each student accomplish the lesson objectives?
I think it was a variety throughout the entire lesson. I have a wide range of abilities and a wide range of learning styles. And so I made sure to incorporate activities that would engage and would reach each one of those learning styles and each one of those abilities. So the song were for those auditory learners who need that to listen to what that vocabulary is and who are engaged in song, are motivated by that. And I have the hand motions for those kinesthetic learners, and we made an anchor chart for those visual learners. And then the differentiated groups allowed me to reach those leveling abilities because I could put texts at their level and I could talk and ask probing questions at their level. And from lows to the highs, I could help them continue to grow at their own individual levels.
And so then what I've heard you say in that comment is that it's really important to you that with each of your lessons, you look at your students and then you vary it even within that time frame so that you are really reaching each one of those different types of students. So that it sounds like to me is that you've really learned who your students are so that you can reach them throughout the day just by varying the way in which you teach the very same thing. So,
Yeah.
the thing you were teaching was text structures, but you did it in a lot of different ways because you know who your students are and the way in which they need to hear that exact same information.
Absolutely. At the beginning of the school year, we took a modalities test, and so they were able to evaluate themselves and the types of learners they were, either auditory, kinesthetic, or a visual learner. And so I've helped them become cognizant of their own learning and the ways in which they learn, and then I try and incorporate those based on that data that I collected at the beginning of the year to ensure that all students are being reached.
That's wonderful. Okay, so what was the most successful or least successful or both parts of the lesson that you presented today?
So I think the most successful was their understanding of truly what each one of those text structures meant, and to begin to identify those within a text, even when there aren't signal words yelling at you saying, however or both or, those types of things. How do you then still analyze that, and what are those strategies that you can use? By the end of the conversation we were saying, what questions do you ask to figure out if it's problem solution or cause and effect, etc. And I could see my kids working through that process, which I think was a strength and a success of the lesson. One of the areas that I think we still need to grow in as a class is truly understanding the purpose authors have for writing using a specific text structure. I think my focus for this lesson was more on the text structures themselves rather than the purpose that authors use for them. But one of the things I noticed on the Padlet that they responded to during independent time was that there was still confusion on whether or not it was in fiction or nonfiction texts. Many of my students were thinking that it was more for the interest level of the passage rather than for the organization and readability of the passage. And so only 8 of my 20 students were able to identify that it was actually for that organizational structure. And so I think that's just an area that we need to continue to talk about and discuss as they are readers and even as they are writers, so they begin to understand that purpose of using a structure to convey a message.
So what I hear there from you is that you have a purpose of follow-up for your lesson. So you found in teaching this lesson that there's actually something that you can move forward with, and you can move to continue to deepen your students' understanding of text structure, and go even farther in their conceptual knowledge of text structure. So you've gathered data to help you to understand where do you go next.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. Okay, so what are some examples that stand out for you in your lesson today? What's standing out for you to grab, to remember?
Let's see. I think that one of the things, that stood out to me was their third task during independent time was to write their own passage, to become those authors using those text structures in order to convey their message. And it was helpful for me to see those students that were able to structure their passage, a well-rounded passage, using those keywords in that structure. For example, I have a student who wrote, do you always have to retie your shoelaces? Are they always bugging you? Well, I'm going to tell you how to fix the problem. First things first, when you tie your shoelaces, tie them the way you normally do it. Then tie it again. You can choose a double knot, a triple knot, or as many times as you want. If that doesn't work, just try buying shoes with Velcro. I hope this solves your problem. And so I think that although we could continue to develop the writing side of it, it was very evident that she understood problem solution and that structure. She identified the problem of not being able to tie her shoelaces and gave a few solutions to solve that problem. And students actually commented, I had them comment on one another's writing to identify that structure so that they could get some feedback on whether or not they successfully structure their paragraphs. And the students that were able to respond to it did identify it as problem solution and pulled out those key pieces of tying your shoelaces versus Velcro and multiple knots, etc. So I think that was a takeaway for me, was to see them being able to apply it in their own writing as well.
Mm-hmm. And I will have to say that was actually an exciting observation for me as well, because it was such an application for me, because they weren't just learning about text structure, but they actually were applying it. So you were asking them to develop a text structure, and not only then to develop it using technology, but then other students were then identifying their own other students' work. And it was an observation that I made when you were in small group. One of the students came over to another student to say, I commented on yours. You know, and the student had already actually put away their Chromebook and was reading, because you had them reading silent reading when they had done all of their tasks. Mm-hmm. And you could just see them light up and be very excited about the idea that they could go back and look at, did that person correctly identify their text structure or not. Mm-hmm. And so they went immediately to their Chromebook to get it out and to look at it. So that application was very engaging for students to be able to create their own and then to comment on each other. So I just wanted to make sure to identify that for you, that was a very good application of the work that you were doing throughout that period of reading. So that was very engaging for me to see. Which activities or actions do you think fostered the most high involvement, and why?
I think probably the most involvement that I got were from the song at the beginning and the game. I think they just naturally lend themselves to engagement and involvement from all students. I think sometimes when you add that reading aspect, those students that struggle with reading tend to check out during that time, because it's a difficult task for them. And not only are you asking them to read, but you're asking them to critically read and analyze more about what they're reading. And so I think that song at the beginning and the game later on had the most engagement, because they were all working together, they were all up and singing. I saw students who never participate in my whole group activities were singing the songs and at least mouthing the words, and so I knew that was grabbing those kids' attention as well. So that was nice to see the engagement there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, when you reflect on your lesson, what are some things that you might have done differently throughout the lesson that would have enhanced the outcome of the lesson?
I think one of the things that I could have done differently was I asked my students to read these paragraphs and to really analyze their structures. And I knew going into small group that was something we were going to do together. We were going to read it, we were going to talk about it. But I think that one way I could have set them up for success for that independent work where they were asked to do similar things and to apply it would be to model it for them, to put a passage up, to read through it, to talk through my own thinking so that they can model kind of how I work through that process. And then to send them off to small groups so that they have some anchor to go back to and a process to follow modeled by me. I eventually did it in small group as I saw that need, but I think as far as my whole group, that would have been helpful to set them up for success. Not only knowing what the structures were, but to then know how do you critically analyze passages for those structures.
That's very good. So what I heard you say there, though, was that, and one of the things that I did observe throughout your period of time is your ability to adjust. And so when you see a need, even if you haven't anticipated that need or haven't planned for that need, you have that ability to adjust immediately. So what I heard you say in that small group was that you didn't plan for the modeling of analyzing that paragraph through text structure, through the class of text structure, but that you saw that need immediately, and so you modeled it within the small group setting for your students so that they understood then what you were asking them to do. So you did the self-talk out loud so that they could hear modeling through that. And that is something that I did notice that you were doing throughout your lesson, that you had the flexibility within you to just immediately take on something when if it wasn't necessarily planned to begin with, you just did that. So that was something that was a strength that I saw in you, that you could just have that flexibility.
Thank you.
What did you learn about yourself when you were teaching this lesson?
I think for me, it validated my ability to engage students. I think that I know I have a very loud personality that is willing to get right in and goof around with kids that's in a purposeful way. And I think seeing their engagement and seeing their excitement and hearing their comments of, wow, this is so fun, and things like that, and their disappointment that reading was ending, validated for me that I had set up a lesson that was engaging and wasn't something that they were going to check out of. And so I think that was validated for me, and I learned that about myself. I think I also learned about myself kind of the need that I have just to continue to ask those probing questions. And I know I do to some extent, and I'm flexible with that, but how do I guide kids to become more self-reflective, to become more cognizant of their own learning, not just when I point it out, but as they're learning, so that they can ask those questions and guide their own education and their own learning path throughout the lesson. Because I think I kind of accepted a lot for them. And so one thing I learned about myself is that I kind of need to give them more freedom in what they need as learners so that they can become more reflective of themselves.
Great. So, what things will you do to ensure, and I think we talked about this a little bit, but to ensure future success or to prevent future failure with text structures?
So again, I think that one thing I need to go back to is just understanding that purpose, to ensure that they understand that it's not just for interest level, but for organization and understanding. So I think that is one piece. I did have a few students who did not demonstrate mastery on the exit ticket. They only got 1 out of the 3 questions right of identifying paragraphs. So for those students, I need to pull them back again to ensure that we kind of talk through those examples on the exit ticket, as well as giving them a few more examples so that they grasp that objective and that from the lesson before we move on, so that I know all of my students are moving forward with that solid understanding of text structures. And I think just continuing to bring it back up as we read, scholastic news articles, or as we're consuming our science books when we're reading that text, just stopping and being aware of the fact of, okay, what is this text structure? Even though we're in science and we're learning about energy and motion, how did the author structure this text so that it's always being brought in, so that it becomes a natural piece of their thinking as they read.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about data. What did the data show? So that's very important to be reflective of your lessons, to go back and say, you had that exit ticket, and so that's something that's very important to say. I've done this lesson now. What did the kids show me that they knew about that lesson? So what did the data show for you?
So as I stated before, prior to coming into this, 20% of my students had shown mastery of understanding of text structures. Based on the 3 questions that they had to answer, which asked them to read a passage and identify the structure that went along with it, the average score was a 2.5 out of 3, which showed me that clearly they had begun to master that. Over half of my students had gotten all of the questions correct. 11 out of the 20 students had fully answered or correctly answered all 3 questions. 7 out of my 20 students had missed 1 question, and I think where I noticed that they struggle is that all good writing is descriptive, and so that is a piece I think moving forward is kind of to talk about how do you, the need to rule everything else out before you choose description, because those students who missed a question chose description instead of choosing the other text structure that fit. So if you combine those, then 18 out of the 20 students had shown mastery overall. And then there were just those 2 students who only got 1 out of 3. I was glad to see no one missed all of them, so at least they were identified one of the passages. Mm-hmm. And so, that's that 10% that totally, needs that more work. And then the 90% who have shown mastery and will continue to move forward. Mm-hmm. So overall, very proud of the data.
That's very good. I did hear in your small groups too, you identifying that need already of students who were picking description mm-hmm. as their first go-to, and you already kind of starting that work on trying to say pick description last, try to go through those questions of other things like could it be problem solution, could it be cause and effect. So you were already starting that work of identifying. They are starting to go to the easy one mm-hmm. because everything tends to be descriptive first. Mm-hmm. So I could see where you were starting to identify that, and then the data supported you by saying that was something that that you needed to identify. What other artifacts do you want to show me? Do we want to go over about the lesson that I hadn't seen before, or things that you had used in the lesson that supported your lesson?
Well, I'll just show you kind of what we went through. This was the graphic organizer that we filled out together. We talked about the different types of text structures, their purpose, why the authors would maybe write that way, and then kind of what are those clue words. Now, we did have the discussion that clue words could go on forever, so this is not the end-all be-all list of clue words, but some of those more common words that students might see, just to help them begin to identify and have a resource to go back to. I have an anchor chart that looks very similar to this, but sometimes it's nice just to have that piece right next to you as well.
Mm-hmm. What I saw about this artifact is that students were really utilizing it in the classroom with the other activities that you had. Mm-hmm. And so just to validate this piece, it wasn't just a worksheet that they were using. So the good part about this was that they were really using it. And the other thing that I saw about this piece as I was observing was that you were really hitting home this purpose part. And so that was something that I know that you had as an objective, and what you were wanting them to do was to go back to ask the questions about, is it telling, for example, cause and effect? Is it saying what happened and why? Can you say that? And they were really going back to utilize this form or this piece of paper to help them in the other activities that you had. So they were carrying that paper with them when they were moving throughout the classroom. So this was a meaningful activity that you had them do, and it wasn't just a piece of paper.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to hear that, because that was the purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And then these 3 you can look through if you'd like. These are the level texts. The top one was for those lower struggling readers. It had a passage, and the first couple just identified the structure for them and gave an organizer so they could kind of understand that logical reasoning. And it all revolved around the topic of soccer, which is an interest of my students in this group. So I knew that they would be more motivated to read because it was about soccer, and so they already had some background knowledge going into it. And then the second half of this packet gave them the passages about gum, and then they had to identify the structures that went along with it as more of that application piece and transfer of from identifying or organizing and having it identified for you to then organizing it and identifying it yourself. This was the on-level kids. It gave them passages about camping. And I asked them to identify the structure. I did not give them the organizer or identify it for them. And I also identified some vocabulary that might be difficult for students to kind of extend them in that area as well as they read. And this had more of the less common signal words. You know, for example, this first one says whereas in here, which is not one that we put on our organizer, but it kind of exposes them to more of those words authors use when they're using compare and contrast and things like that. And this last one was for my above level students, and it was about onions and just different facets of onions, which I think is a quirky topic for kids, again, increasing that engagement. But this one didn't really have those signal words in it, so they really had to think about, you know, is it telling you a problem and ways to solve it? And if not, it's not problem solution, because there was not an obvious, oh, it says this, and so this is the structure. And so, as well as the vocabulary here brought some good discussion of what does that word mean and what are they, what context clues can assist you. And so those are the 3 levels that they used as we went through the guided reading.
So this is clear differentiation. I mean, because it shows the different ways in which you're reaching students at their different levels and actually their different interest levels. And so that's something that clearly is a strength for you, to be able to identify groups of students and what they need and how they can work at their level to still do the same lesson objective, but at a level that they can understand. So that is definitely a strength for you.
Thank you.
So very good. Okay, so what has this lesson triggered for you for your goals for your own professional development?
Well, I think one of the things that was a positive was I had just recently gone to the Get Your Teach On conference that was all about setting the stage to engage and ways to have meaningful, rigorous activities that engage students but that require them to think critically as well. And so I was able to utilize, you know, the headbands game actually came from that conference, and a few of my call and responses came from that conference. And the song, not necessarily that specific song, but the idea of using parodies and songs in the classroom came from that conference as well. So taking back those learning pieces and applying them into the classroom was part of what I wanted to grow. You know, I went there to grow professionally, and then to apply them helped as well. One area that I think I would like to continue to grow professionally moving forward would just be that my questioning skills, being able to ask students questions that guide them to the answer, more so than explaining the answers to them, and just even have them rely on one another for those questions and those answers. And so kind of being more of that facilitator in discussions and how to effectively have that role, so that the conversation doesn't go down the total wrong path, but that they are relying on one another for support and for answers.
What do you think that looks like for you? Is that a conference, professional development, webinar, other teachers, modeling?
I have been looking for a conference, but I haven't really found one that I think quite meets the needs. So for right now, it's going into my colleagues' classrooms and kind of, you know, those students or those colleagues of mine who I know ask those good questions or who are more of those facilitators so that I can learn from their example. As well as I have several teachers I follow online through their blogs or through their Instagram and on Twitter. And so just kind of immersing myself in other teaching to hopefully gain strategies from them to apply to my own classroom and my own teaching, and really focusing on that facilitator questioning piece as I research and learn about other coworkers or other educators.
So then what I hear from you is that something that I could do is maybe help research that and maybe find some best practice out there that I would find valuable and maybe present it to you and say, is this something maybe that you would be interested in? So keep an ear out there of some professional development or good things out there that I hear on this particular topic that you might be interested in, and then give it to you and see if it's something that you might be interested in.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Okay. And so some of the things I've mentioned throughout our time, some of those strengths that I have seen in your listening, and there's so many. And one of the questions that you asked me in our pre-observation conference was time on task for students, because you feel like your class is an overactive class. And I will have to say that you have managed that really well. That's something that I noticed, is that your classroom management and classroom culture, you really have that down. You have a lot of expectations for students, and you have them posted. You remind them constantly about those expectations, and you don't just tell them, you have them tell you. So it's something that is interactive for them. They're the ones reminding themselves, really. You're engaging them to tell you. So the time on task, actually, I think you'll be quite surprised, was really high. So in that 90-minute period, only 3% of the time, 10% of the students or less were off task. So really, there was a lot of high engagement. So if you flip that, then that means 90 to 100% of the students, the entire 90-minute period of the time, were on task. And so that was a really high engagement class. Some of the other data that I collected as I was observing was that you had 7 smooth transitions through that 90-minute time, so there was no time wasted because the students went immediately from one activity to the other, and there was no time where they were not doing something, or where when they went from one activity to another, somebody was misbehaving or didn't get right to the next task. That you used 10 different strategies that I observed anyway in that 90-minute period of time. So they had lots of different activities to engage in. So you definitely had a lot of different ways in which you were reaching a student. And throughout that lesson, I observed 5 different formative assessments that you used. So you were constantly, in your own mind, making sure that kids were getting it, and then you were adjusting yourself. And so those were just a few. There were many strengths that I observed, but those were the ones that I actually were taking data on and observing. And then we talked about standards. You had some that you felt you were going to accomplish, and then I added my own that I personally, just having many walkthroughs and knowing you as a teacher, thought that I would observe. And I had many different modeled evidence that I could write down. And so those standards that you identified, standard 1, standard 4, standard 6, and standard 7, I was not short of any evidence that I had, so I had a whole list of things. And then I added standard 2 and standard 3, and I could find lots of evidence for that as well. So as far as areas of strength, you have lots of things that you do excellently in the classroom.
Thank you.
So for an area of improvement, as I was reflecting on our observation, I thought about standard 5. So standard 5 says uses a variety of methods to monitor student learning, and actually you kind of mentioned it too in our conversation throughout this time. So one of the things that I think that you could focus on as you move through the rest of this year and as you set goals for next year is to continue to think about having students take ownership of their own self-reflection and have their own way of having progress monitoring and their own way of having self-direction in their learning. And so less teacher directed and more student directed. And so that's something that I did put down here as something that we could work on. And then you also mentioned that as well. And so that's something that we'll just kind of focus on and develop as we move forward. The other thing is just through conversation with you, we talked about how you don't really have a parent newsletter or a way of communicating with parents besides just you email as they email you, but you don't have something as you communicate, just in general to parents. So moving forward, I'd like you to think about that and just having some way of communicating or a website or something, and like start small. So something maybe monthly or bi-monthly or quarterly, something small, just to kind of go, here's what's happening in our classroom. That parents like to feel connected, so it gives them a way of feeling connected. So that would be something that would be a good way to continue to grow and improve. And so as we are kind of wrapping up our conference today, I would like to ask you to kind of just take a minute, reflect about everything that we've talked about, things that I've seen, and then I'm going to ask you to kind of give me a 5-finger summary of the things that we've talked about today. Just kind of talk back to me some of the things that you learned and you'll take away, your takeaway.
Okay, so I think that one of the things I heard today in our discussion is that student engagement is a positive strength of my classroom, which is nice to hear as I continue to work hard to make sure that that's happening, as well as differentiation in meeting those student needs, both by interest and by reading level. One thing that we're going to work on together is improving just that student reflection piece and how to make that authentic in the classroom, as well as just kind of helping them, helping that facilitator role on my end and putting more of the ownership on them. I'm going to work on looking into a newsletter and starting small, so that it's something that's attainable and not overwhelming. But a way to connect parents into what we're doing so that they can support that at home and discuss text structures, but in this case at home with their students as well, to help solidify what we're doing in class. And I think that the transitions in my classroom and the different varying activities are strengths to help my social kiddos who I guess appear more off task to me sometimes because they are social with one another, more engaged, or that those help the engagement and they're not as off task as I thought. It's nice to hear that they were talking about, I commented on yours and they wanted to go check, because I think sometimes those interactions, sitting in small group and observing those, look to be off task to me, but it's nice to hear that their conversations are actually on topic of what we're doing. They're just socializing about it, which is what they need to do as students. So for me, I'll be more cognizant of really what are those conversations that they're having before assuming that they're off task.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you for the summary. I appreciate that. I think that we had good observation time and good pre-post conferences, and we'll just continue to work together this year to have growth and move forward. And I appreciate you as a teacher.
Excellent. I look forward to it. Thank you.